It is not uncommon to see media reports that assign a level of blame onto faith-based schools for damaging social cohesion in society. There's a culture of clash between secular and religious viewpoints. Today's guest has co-written a study on this topic. Ray Pennings is the Executive Vice President of the Christian think tank Cardis, and he joins me now from Ottawa. Rock and Ray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Ray, some believe that faith-based schools tend to shelter their students from the real world and produce people who are intolerant of others' viewpoints. What did your study find?
Well, it's actually a series of studies that we've done over the course of the past decade in partnership with Notre Dame. And what we have done is we've looked at the adult population on 3 separate occasions in the US and 3 separate occasions in Canada. So it's actually 6 representative studies. We looked at adults 23 to 39. We had a control group that went to public school. Then we had other adults who had the majority of their K-12 education in all sorts of non-government schools. We didn't just look at faith-based schools, but for the purposes of this, including faith-based schools, especially Protestant and Catholic. And what we found is that when it comes to their adult behaviors, they tend to be more civically engaged than students from similar social economic status who went to public school.
So how did you really determine which people groups tended to clash more and which tended to be more civil?
What we did is we measured behaviors on everyone's part. So we looked at 3 things. We looked at spiritual outcomes, academic outcomes, as well as civic outcomes. So we asked, did you vote? Do you volunteer? We used Stats Canada's criteria of volunteering and charitable giving, so we could compare to the population as a whole. So on a whole range of measures, what we found is they were more, especially on the civic side, not on every measure necessarily. Ironically, they tend to vote a little less in some jurisdictions, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. They protest a little less and on different things. But when we take the total cumulative engagement and involvement, graduates of faith-based schools are equal or greater involved than graduates of public schools.
Well, it's interesting that you say the graduates of religious-based schools stand out when it comes to giving and volunteering. How do those attributes contribute toward a more civil, tolerant society, Ray?
Well, the very fact of giving and volunteering means you're not thinking about yourself, first of all, but you're thinking about someone else. And when you're engaged in that, it's an activity, but it's also a view of the world. Do you look at the world as a whole and your place in it? Or do you look at yourself and everyone else in terms of how they can serve you? 2 different mindsets in terms of approach to public life. And on a aggregate level, we can say with significant confidence and data to back it up that faith-based graduates have an other-mindedness which results in civic engagement and care of neighbor.
Now, recent Barna research shows that church leaders, parents, and schools are not speaking to one another enough on these matters. Our pastors and priests tend to avoid the topic of school choice, and apparently very few parents ever ask about it. Why do you think that is?
Yes, this survey, in addition to the regular surveys we did, we just partnered with Barna to do a survey of pastors, 650 pastors and priests in the United States, as well as we have a smaller survey in Canada. What we found is that for the most part, that conversation is not happening between church, home, and school conversations. In the occasions where it is, it's a delicate issue for pastors, obviously, and priests within their own congregations. There often will be a diversity of views, some kids attending public school, some a local faith-based school, homeschooling. So it's a difficult issue, but by and large, the conversation is not really happening.
Now, Protestant churches tend not to affiliate with any particular school, and apparently only about half of pastors encourage parents to check out a Christian school. Is the financial cost maybe a big reason?
There were a variety of reasons that were there. Cost was the largest single factor that was identified. Sometimes there were concerns about the local school or the quality of it. In some occasions, that was a factor. And in other factors, there was also a sense that encouraging kids to go to public school was a way also of exercising your faith and communicating and participating in the neighborhood around you.
Now, you talk about how pastors face pressure on social issues. They will be criticized if they do speak out on them, or also criticized if they don't speak out. So it's a non-win situation. How do they handle this?
It's a difficult matter, but certainly, and it will vary based on your own religious traditions and theological principles. But for most, it's an imperative. If they're going to be faithful to their own convictions, they are going to be required, so to speak, to address these issues. I think there is a growing recognition that parishioners live in a pluralistic society. And it's not only having a position on these issues, but learning how to communicate these positions with people who disagree with you in civil and constructive ways so that society can flourish.
Now, your paper points out that a healthy society is not only a matter of getting systems, laws, and policies right, it also requires attention to the formation of citizens with the proper habits and virtues for civic life. How important is it to choose the right school for our kids?
Well, education is holistic education. That's one of the reasons why our study, somewhat distinct from many other studies that look at education, did not just look at academic achievement. We just didn't count how many how many kids went to university and what sort of universities they did. We also looked at civic engagement, which we've already touched on, the volunteering, giving, participating in society, voting. We also talked on spiritual formation. And there is a sense in which education is for life. It's not just for work, it's not just for church, it's for life as a whole. And I think it's important that we measure the outcomes of education, also looking at all of the effects.
So Ray, let me ask you something. What are your thoughts on religion becoming more aligned or affiliated with political parties? Is that maybe a dangerous path to go down?
It is, although when you look at it, we've collected data over a decade now, and I would think the mainstream myth that Christians are in a particular party or are politically aligned, when we actually we see diversity of voting patterns. You have Christians on the left and on the right. So those who get involved sometimes tend to be passionate in terms of their involvement, and that's probably as much the nature of politics. Politicals, whether religious or not, tend to be pretty partisan and passionate sorts. But certainly, I don't think you can take a look at the overall outcomes of religious schools and say there's a schooling effect which direct towards one party or the other. That's more a consequence of social economic status and family background than it is of schooling.
So how can Christian believers bring their convictions into public life while fully respecting the rights of others in a pluralistic society?
I would say that the very first thing as a Christian, my responsibility is to see the imago Dei, the image of God in everyone, including the person I most passionately disagree with politically. I think when I begin to see my political opponent as a fellow image bearer of God, now all of a sudden that frames the nature of my conversation with him or her. Then secondly, I think you can realize the fact that we can disagree without being disagreeable. We can hold to positions and we can argue that based on data, based on material that's available to all of the public, and have robust arguments. Such it has always been in societies, and I suppose it will always be that way. But I would suggest that if we approach it by seeing the image of God and do it with a tone of hospitality, respect, we'll have something that looks quite different than Twitter today.
So how can we avoid the almost inevitable name-calling and put-downs when people disagree over like abortion, religion, and LGBTQ2+ issues?
Again, I would go back to what I just said in terms of the image of God. If I see the person I'm dealing with as a fellow image bearer of God, I am going to have a respect for that person, even if they live a lifestyle I totally disagree with. And if they in turn would see me in the similar sort of way, well, now we have a different sort of conversation, sort of name calling, and the two groups going into their own ghettos, which unfortunately is too much part of life today.
Let me ask you something too. I've talked to certain professors at universities who disagree with some of the ideologies that are being preached and pushed on students at these universities, but they still have to kind of fit in with the norm there. So how can we get back as a society to a place where it's actually acceptable to agree to disagree and still get along,
Well, I think sometimes we think that if we only, all went to the mushy middle and found the things that we have in common, that somehow is the answer. I actually take quite a different point of view. I think it is important for us to be able to articulate what it is, our most deeply held convictions, articulate them into the public square, but find a way that does so respectfully and engages in an affirmation of the other person that they too have deeply held convictions. And it's in the dialogue that actually I think we will learn to respect and grow with each other. It's in the discussion of difference rather than the avoidance of difference.
And we have to understand, really understand where the other person is coming from, their background, where they grew up.
And taking, I would challenge, we live in a Christian society or a pluralistic society. I would challenge, Christians along the way rather than, segregating or coming to conclusions about people who are different than themselves, learning to understand. What do we know about Islam? What do we know about Sikhism? Do you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite and a Wahhabi? Just as we would expect them to know the differences between a Catholic and a Protestant and the various stripes within, and we recognize that there are some behaviors or beliefs that are more predictable in some groups than others. I think we need to become far more nuanced in understanding and appreciating our neighbor.
Now, you've often talked about spaces of grace when it comes to churches. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think when I think of religion, I think of three components to religion. There's an affirmation of a set of beliefs which are core to the faith. And as a Christian, for me, obviously the Bible and the teachings of the Bible are fundamental to that. There are a set of religious practices. I pray, I read the Bible, I attend worship, I participate in communion. And then there are behaviors that are out there in the public square as well. My love of neighbor, my giving, my approach to work as vocation. All of my life is religious, not just when I'm in church. I think church communities need to understand equipping people for living all of life according to their faith commitments. And I also think we need to be generous and hospitable, recognizing that, we confess we're all sinners. We need to be a place where sinners are welcome, where they're not judged, where they're welcome, where they're engaged with, but yes, where we affirm the truth of God's word, which doesn't mean we're automatically going to agree with every opinion or every lifestyle.
I guess, Ray, it really boils down to loving thy neighbor, but what if you have a neighbor that's not really that lovable?
Well, I would look at, I think all of us in that sense, when we see the unlovable neighbor, probably need to hold up the mirror, and the scripture says that when we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So for those who confess the name of Christ, we weren't all that lovable either, and he loved us.
And what's that expression again when you're pointing at someone else? You got one finger pointing at them, three fingers pointing right back at you, right? Ray Pennings is the Executive Vice President of the Christian think tank Cardis. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.